Great. Well, welcome everybody to the Gen3 Forum office hours for Helm Charts. This is a follow-up to our last Gen3 Forum. This is going to be a lot less formal. It's really kind of a question and answer. So there's not much content at the beginning, although I think Jawad has a little bit of an intro. Yeah, there's not too much to say. Welcome. Thanks for coming. Hopefully you brought some questions. After Jawad, gives a spiel, I think we're going to open it up to questions. If anything is too complicated, we may not be able to answer it here, and might have to refer to it later or suggest you post on the Slack channel for quicker updates. Let me just mention before I forget also, there is another meeting next week. If you are interested in contributing to our Helm Charts repo, not just learning about, but actually, giving back to the open source code, which you don't have to, there's no pressure to, but we have another meeting next week on that. That is on Thursday at 3 p.m. So just, DM me if you want an invite to that. So with that, I'll get out of the way and turn it over to Jawad because it's really Jawad's show today. So Jawad, take it away.
Sure. Thank you so much. I kind of wanted to keep it like as informal as you said. It's really cool that y'all are interested in what we're doing and what we're working on. So I know I had to miss that last call since I was on PTO. But I kind of wanted to hear about your experiences so far, what's been working, what's not been working, where the struggles are, and then I can go over a little bit about like the roadmap that we're thinking about dealing with over the next few sprints when it comes to the Helm charts, what we're going to target, and I'm hoping your input can help shape that work as well. I don't know if you guys want me to go over like what we're planning on working first, or if you guys want to do questions first, but I'm open up for either.
I know this is Chris Black. I'm biased because we're working on our own deployments and everything. I'm curious about like better documentation and testing on using external Elasticsearch and setting the ES endpoint URL and making sure that all works clearly. Because right now, our deployments always do the Elasticsearch within the same Gen3 deployment, but we might have Elasticsearch somewhere else, whether in the same cluster in a different namespace or via, Elasticsearch as a service on something or other. So we just want to be more confident about how we handle Elasticsearch.
Sure. I can share what we've done with Elasticsearch so far and what we've tested. So we've tested.
And then I guess then the other thing is version upgrade for Elasticsearch, which I know is on the list as well.
Correct. The version upgrade is really close. I think the code has been completed at least, and we're in the process of testing it as we speak this sprint. So once we have that ready to go, I'll start working on getting a newer version of Elasticsearch tested with our Helm charts, hopefully using the official chart so we can just include them as subcharts in our main chart. Back to your first question about how we've tested multiple Elasticsearch endpoints. So obviously we've tested the local one, the one that it's included in Gen3. The second version of Elasticsearch that we have tested out is in AWS. And for that, we use basically a proxy sidecar that is running inside Kubernetes as well, but is proxying the requests to the external cluster. The reason for that is because AWS's Elasticsearch requires us to sign all the requests. So this middle proxy is actually how we do it in production today as well, without the Helm charts. I haven't tested any Elastic Cloud installation yet, but that's also something that we can test and try to document. The general idea when we started with these Helm charts was to decouple the deployments from the infrastructure. But I think when it comes to documentation of setting up everything still need to document at least the external dependencies a little bit better. So some of the focus going forward in our upcoming sprints is going to be catching up documentation to all the work that we've been doing as well. But yeah, we've tested 2 different Elasticsearch deployments, essentially, the managed Elasticsearch in AWS and the local one. Did you have any preference on, or how are you guys thinking about using Elasticsearch?
We think it's likely that we're going to use the upstream Elasticsearch Helm charts to deploy it in a more vanilla way. And manage it in a more vanilla way. But if you're going to import those and have them as a subchart of the Gen3 chart, that's fine too. We just don't want to get caught on an old version, an old dependency, and unable to manage an upgrade. Right. Yeah, so that's kind of where we're thinking. And then the other part of this is for the built-in one that's when you're doing like a desktop deployment on Rancher Desktop, our understanding is it doesn't persist against across pod restarts. So that's also an issue. I don't know if there's a relatively easy option to have, the dev environment with self-included Elasticsearch also handle persist across restarts or not. But that's another little minor pain point for us. Okay, we've actually heard of that pain point with Postgres as well, although with Postgres you can enable persistence relatively easily. It's just setting that value. With that Elasticsearch, we didn't include a persistent volume claim because it was supposed to be like a temporary stopgap measure until we got upgraded Elasticsearch. But we can definitely try to include a persistent volume for Elasticsearch. The thing is that you'd have to do some manual cleanup between installs then, because Helm doesn't clean up persistent volume claims, essentially. So you have to delete that. And for any, we can definitely allow an override to do persistent volumes, essentially. Okay, that sounds good. And so it sounds like Elasticsearch is, among the Elasticsearch upgrade is close to done. And then, I know New York Genome Center ourselves and other people will be poking at the Elasticsearch deployments and using the ES endpoint. You mentioned Postgres, that as well. Right now we deploy within as a subchart of our Gen3, but in production we probably don't want to do it that way. On Google Cloud Platform, we'd expect to use Cloud SQL. So we need to figure out how to tie that in. That's not as big of a priority for us because the built-in one does kind of work. It doesn't go away on restart, and it's suitable kind of for low level traffic for, low production as well as dev. But yes, the way we connect, similar to how you have an ES endpoint or whatever to connect to the Elasticsearch, we're going to need to have a good way of managing the how do you connect to a Cloud SQL instance? Because there's also just like on Amazon, there's a few different ways to do it. I think the easiest is, especially in a Kubernetes environment, is to use the Cloud SQL proxy kind of sidecar container. But I don't know if that's easy to genericize across different cloud providers. Because we can just on Cloud SQL, you can just bind it to a regular IP and then make that IP available and then do all of the networking. But that's not the preferred way to do it. Okay. I am actually not that familiar with Cloud SQL, but I can add that as a to-do item for us to explore, because we might want to do something similar whenever we are going to play with, or if we're ever going to play with Google Cloud, essentially. So I'm going to take a note. I think Amazon RDS may have a similar pattern. Where they have this kind of like in-between proxy where like, well, if you want, you can make a shared VPC and have an IP, or you can have all of these other things, or you can use this little tool we made that kind of negotiates the authentication and networking between the two contexts for you. Right. So that way you don't have to do DNS, you don't have to care about IPs, you just care about like the name of the RDS resource. Right.
For our deployments, we use regular RDS, or we've tried Aurora serverless. The way we do it with the private IPs. It just slots better in with the rest of the architecture because you still have to authenticate. And having a sidecar proxy, or like having a proxy, just becomes a point of failure between you and the SQL server, essentially. And if that proxy goes down, then your whole database traffic is down as well. So that's why we're opting for private endpoints that we can hit from within the cluster. So basically just relying on DNS. Although I haven't tried that proxy architecture for SQL yet.
Yeah, so Cloud SQL proxy is a little different, and we can talk about it more as a separate thread. But the pattern is you don't have you can set up a single Cloud SQL VM and then tunnel everything through it. But the idea is instead, anytime you're trying to connect to SQL, you run another SQL proxy instance right there close to where you're doing your database connection. So anything that actually does a MySQL or a Postgres connection, that pod also has a SQL proxy sidecar. And that proxy sidecar doesn't really do like network hop traffic. It kind of negotiates what the network path should be and can also handle auth for you. Now, we still use table-based auth because that's what all of our tools use, as does Gen3. I don't think that's easy to get away from that. But maybe in the future, that because I think RDS likely supports that as well, where rather than doing the typical Postgres users in a table, you actually do it in a cloud-aware identity thing.
Right, using IAM or something.
Yeah.
Okay, that's a interesting pattern to explore, at least. I can't say I have any experience with it, but I'll definitely add that as some of our to look into.
As kind of another way to understand it, what it allows you to do is, let's say you spin up a new VM and you need to connect to some weird MySQL server or whatever, and it's in a different GCP project in a different region, all these auth stuff, whatever. All you have to do within your app or within your web page is hit localhost :3306. That's it.
Right.
Everything else is handled for you.
Right.
So your database URLs become localhost. And then the proxy handles all of the network negotiation for you.
Correct. But then you have to set up identities for all of your applications so that they're accessing instead of like role-based access control. I think it's going to get a little bit more complicated, just the more I think about it, because then each application has its own identity within your cloud, and you can restrict based on that identity, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, you can share a service account across multiple services or pods or whatever else as well. So you don't have to create a separate one for each identity. And if you're still using the table-based auth, I mean, just like we do today, you don't necessarily have a separate table-based auth Postgres username for every microservice or anything like that.
I think we do today.
Well, good for you. Well, that's great. That's actually the better, more secure way to do it. I was just trying to say you don't have to have that complexity.
Right.
But yes, if you're going to do that same model and then move it out to cloud-aware IAM identities and stuff like that, Google Kubernetes Engine has something called workload identity federation or workload identity that's beyond just using like their compute engine service account. It kind of like moves their IAM down into the Kubernetes aware realm, which is nifty. But I don't know a ton about it, to be honest.
Okay, I just found the page. I believe AWS has something similar, but then you have to annotate that service account essentially and map it up to an IAM role in AWS. But this is kind of interesting to see and learn about. I wasn't aware that Google Cloud offered that right out of the box. Yeah. Okay. So, but Cloud SQL and external Elasticsearch is definitely something that we can try testing with. And as we have more around the Elasticsearch upgrade as well, we'll be able to share. With Elasticsearch, there's also the ETL job. And I kind of wanted to talk a little bit about what we're thinking about with the ETL jobs. Because if you have ever used Gen3 before Helm Charts, there was a concept of having an admin VM. That admin VM allowed you to administrate a lot of the day-to-day or like one-off tasks, such as kicking off the ETL jobs. With the Helm pattern, the idea is to not be tied to a VM to be able to manage and administrate Gen3. So we are working on a solution to be able to trigger ETL and other sort of jobs using the API. So we do have a job engine called Sour, which we haven't ported over to Helm yet, but that's something that we're going to port over. So you can at least trigger off ETL or other jobs using the APIs, essentially. And it's still going to be behind the authentication and authorization boundary of Gen3. So administrators of Gen3 can then kick off such jobs. For example, if you need to run a new user YAML or a user sync on a schedule, we're hoping to be able to do all of that from the APIs. And then down the line, we can possibly open up the path for like a administration page where managing a Gen3 instance can be done directly from within Gen3, essentially. Another thing that we've kind of created a proof of concept of, and we want to enhance a little bit within our Helm charts, is the ability to do versioned data releases. If you've ever tried and made it work, the DB restore jobs basically takes snapshot of a data that can be from any commons. So that's all your Postgres databases and Elasticsearch indices, and being able to just restore them. That's going to be very handy when you're trying to move data between staging and production, or from a dev to staging phase. Being able to snapshot your data and have it be versioned, and then restore that version data from S3 or some sort of object store. That model is something that we're trying to enhance. And that way you're also limiting the amount of times that you need to run the ETL job, because that can be costly. Yeah. With Sour, we're also trying to incorporate the PFP jobs that exist today. They also rely on Sour. So there is a service called Pelican that is responsible for the PFP exports. So that's also on our roadmap to be able to incorporate into these Helm charts. Another thing that has been requested, and we are trying to line up in our future sprints, is the DICOM viewer. DICOM viewer exists in cloud automation, but does not exist in Helm today. So that is something that we're also going to Helmify over the next few sprints to be able to use in our Helm charts, essentially. So I kind of roughly went over our roadmap over the next couple of or next few sprints at least. So it's going to be the ETL and architecture of running one-off jobs, the PFP exports and workspaces in general within Helm, snapshot and restore of data releases, Elasticsearch upgrade, the DICOM viewer. But first and foremost, I think the main focus of our upcoming sprints is going to be catching up with documentation, because I think we're lagging behind a little bit there, and making it easier to understand how to deploy, because we take it for granted a lot of times, some of the stuff that we do, but that might not be super obvious for anyone trying to use our Helm charts, essentially. Yeah.
Are there other questions? I think, Jua, that was kind of what you were hoping to present, right?
Yeah.
So yeah, please, others on the call, if you want to pipe up with questions, you can also type them in chat if you prefer.
Yeah. Or if you have any requests for us
Right.
to help solve some of the issues that you might be running into,
There is a question in the chat.
Mhm.
This is Somesh, actually. We have tried deploying the default Helm chart, which was provided and on OpenStack Magnum. Everything went very well and very smooth deployment. Really, no hassle as such. We're easy to give good amount of time to deploy the Gen3. Really appreciate that point. And want to implement a couple of customizations like to the portal, metadata service. Similarly, want to make changes to user.yaml and run the pens, all these services. So we have not tried at making such customizations. Current documentation, APIs I have probably might have not looked into the right place. There is guidance over there, or else we need to start implementing them in the how it is for the customer.
A guidance on how to override the user YAML and the portal customizations.
Yes,
Yeah. I don't think there is any explicit documentation on that, and I'm gonna take note of like on this point, do like an end-to-end documentation on how to customize all the things. Because if there's one thing Gen3 can do, it's very customizable. With that said, the way you do it, I can actually try to show it. Let's see. So for each of our charts, we expose the values YAML. So for example, for portal, if you want to do any overrides, they're all going to be exposed through the values YAML. So if you're deploying the Gen3 chart, you can override the values for each chart by adding a like the service name. So for example, for portal, the rest of portal values would go underneath here. And to figure out exactly what you can override, you have to check the table for portal. Over here, yeah. So all the GitOps configs is going to be under like portal, and then the child element GitOps, and then you have the files that we usually have, like the created by, the fav icon, the CSS, and the JSON file, and also the logo. So what it would look like inside the values YAML is something similar to this. So you have the GitOps as the parent object, and then the JSON, if you want to do portal customizations, you can do that. And then the fav icon, I believe this is in base 64. Yeah, same thing with the logo, you base 64 encoded, and the other file. And then you can override the general files that you usually have in your manifest. So your values YAML file becomes like your old manifest JSON, essentially, from Cloud Automation World. There's also a way, and I'm trying to move us more towards that as well. So today, our portal image, it takes a little bit of time to start up because it runs Webpack on startup. So I've added a documentation. If you wanna, you can pre-build an image and make sure it starts a lot faster. So you build once and then you can deploy it to multiple places. And for example, over here, I've included like a GitOps JSON as a file for my dev environment. And then you can just build this Docker file for your environment as well. The thing is that this will still rely on a sheepdog and a peregrine instance that needs to be up, because our portal needs to be able to query the GraphQL schema in order to build the exploration pages. But you don't have to use this pattern. This is mostly for low resource environments such as laptops, where you don't have like 2 gigs of memory available in addition to all the services, and 2 CPUs to be able to build portal every time it gets deployed. So you do it once, essentially. Yeah. And for the user YAML, I think there is some sample values here. So you can just have your user YAML, but it just needs to be a under this key, and then you can include it. And then this file can be included as another set of values YAML files. I believe there should be some documentation on using multiple values file. If not, then that's also something that we can add in our documentation. I think over here there should be something, but yeah. So if you want to have multiple values YAML, so like if you want to split out your fence config, your user YAML, maybe your portal stuff, then you can do that. You just have to include it multiple times in your Helm upgrade command, essentially.
Okay.
Did that answer all your questions, Somesh, about that?
Yeah, mostly. Actually, sir, how about the monitoring part, like Prometheus alerting kind of features? Can we inject?
Yeah. So is there anything specific that you want to expose, like some metrics from Gen3 that Prometheus can scrape, or?
Yes, that's what actually, especially gather the specific metrics from the running instances and push the notifications to the stakeholders. That's what the plan right now. So injecting the more, scraping the values from the instances or doing such kind of customizations.
Right. I think we tried a little bit or a little while ago, at least in cloud automation, to start including to expose a few metrics. So from, I think we exposed UWSGI and Nginx metrics, but nothing like Gen3 specific in our pods. That's definitely something that we can have as our to-do. I know there are things that are outside Gen3 that we're eventually going to tackle. So I had a quick talk with Colin here a few weeks ago where we're talking about tooling outside of Gen3 to manage basically the whole deployment lifecycle. So we touched upon a few topics such as security tools and monitoring tools that we kind of want to set up at least an initial guidance on how to get started with. And I think Prometheus can kind of fall underneath there as well, under the same bucket. That topic can get very complex, and I want to be a little bit careful because the more we add to our stack, then the more stuff that I feel like we have to support. And keeping it vanilla as the base and just adding guidance is my preference. With that said, tools such as Rancher, so not the desktop version, but like the actual Rancher tool to manage production cluster, can help alleviate some of that pain. So managing your actual cluster. So you mentioned you have a OpenStack cluster.
Right.
I believe Rancher can manage that as well as the GKE and AWS clusters as well. But I have to play around with it a little bit more. Last time I played around with it was pre-pandemic, and there's been a lot that's changed since then. Yeah, so including tools such as Prometheus and security tools. I think, Colin, you mentioned NewVector. We're also exploring, I think it's called Threat Mapper or something internally now. But basically just at least be able to give guidance on how to monitor and secure any sort of Gen3 environment. As yeah.
Yeah, just to echo what you said, Jawad, it's some of the metrics and things can be gathered by just using standard Kubernetes tools. Like if you already have a Prometheus and Grafana running for monitoring in the cluster, it should just pick up general metrics from the workloads in the first place anyway. So there's a number that can be done from that, but that's kind of the Kubernetes way a little bit too. It's you have the applications that are adjacent to each other, right? That are assistive and helping each other. And so we could probably add Prometheus to the stack and use it for some nice things, but I don't know that it would. Other people are already going to have Prometheus in place, and there could be some guidance on how to specifically configure Gen3 to talk with an existing Prometheus instance and some other things there, but that it would be interesting to explore. I don't think Gen3 probably wants to manage that like an opinionated monitoring stack or logging stack there. I'm not sure. But guidance is definitely, I think, needed.
Yeah.
I have a final question. Suppose, actually, the kind of input that I'm trying to take from you. Actually, we are running Gen3 run ETL other jobs likewise. Okay, so once we have a mechanism which I have not tried at the customizations part. So is it the same way, or is how we can run the ETL jobs or something, the Helm-based deployment?
So that's kind of what I talked about. We're working on nailing the infrastructure for running those one-off jobs. Today, we don't have a really good way of triggering ETL or running ETL. I know, Liam, you tried running ETL as a one-off job in your environment, but that still requires like access to the underlying Kubernetes cluster, essentially, where the direction that I am hoping that we can move this in is to be able to trigger ETL using APIs. So you can do API calls to trigger an ETL, essentially, using Sour. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think we've got some that are running as cron jobs in Kubernetes.
Yep. Best place to set the Postgres credentials. Sure, I can go over that real quick. Let's see whether this would have it. This won't. Okay, I can just go into each single service then. So each service that has a Postgres instance, it exposes. So if you have external Postgres, then these global values will be the ones that are taken account for. So we need the master user password so that we are able to create databases and create users and all of that. But in your question, I believe you want to persist the local Postgres instance across multiple installs. But since we auto-generate the credentials for the database that was spun up might be different if you do it that way. We do allow, let's see if I can find that here. So there is a separate Postgres credential section in the values YAML. So if you just persist the username and password in here, so for each service, you would have in your main values YAML, so you would have Peregrine and then a child object of Postgres and a username and password. Then this will be used instead of the auto-generated one. And then once you do restart your Postgres pods, then the password will stay the same because then it's static instead of being dynamic. And you should be able to use the same password across installs essentially, and your Postgres instances will stay the same. If you don't provide a password or a username, I don't think the username is that important, but at least the password is auto-generated. So if you don't provide a password between Helm installs and you persist the data, then you're going to run into a mismatch where Gen3 will complain that it's not able to connect to databases essentially.
Thank you. That's great.
How do I make that a
Why is that set up? I just can't remember.
there we
Are
go.
you generating a secret from that config, like with the helper on install?
Yes,
I guess
we.
unrender.
What is that?
Yep.
Remember,
So I believe it's
The inbox is
it's in here. So this is how we define our secrets essentially. So we're looking for we're looking for provided values, and if you don't get one, it all boils down to this random alphanumeric function, essentially. So, and then we go through and find like the which one that will stick, essentially. But if you do provide a value, then that value is used across installs as well.
In the, are you thinking about in the when we talked about some of the Helm refactor, maybe on some of these we probably include an option for using like a secret name. There's an existing secret.
Yep.
And that's just like we'll just add it to the helper.
Exactly. So we would have to expand these helper functions to also, like, if there is a provided secret, then you manage the secrets outside of Helm. That way you're able to check in your main values YAML file, which does not include any secrets, to a public repository. So you can use more of the GitOps tools, essentially. That is a little bit harder lift and shift, but at least for the Postgres passwords, we can easily be able to do that. So Postgres password and the certificates, and then we just have to go through and figure out if there's a need to do that with, for example, the fence config and other secrets, and then you can manage those secrets outside of your Helm installation. Yeah.
How are you feeling on the some of the like the file directory structure kind of refactor stuff, or the umbrella pattern stuff that we talked about?
Is the security?
I know if
so
that was like on hold or you're on it.
I think that's going to be a little bit down the line, because if you start changing on that, it's going to be a bigger lift and shift, because you were planning on having everything be under the Gen3 folder, essentially, inside charts here, right? Because I think that's what we talked about. Yeah.
Instead of,
I have
Or
to
at least break it out. Yeah, I don't know. I'm still thinking about that too. Maybe we could have a separate chat about that again, and because you still want the directory of all the charts because people are deploying them independently.
Yeah. So yeah, it is that, because you kind of want to allow.
That being said,
Yeah, for the rest of the folks, what we're talking about is like right now, all of the different charts are kind of siblings. They're all alongside each other. But for the most part, when you're adopting these, you're going to look for the Gen3 folder and then use that as kind of your core folder to deploy. You'll see that in a lot of other repositories where there's like dependent charts, but they're being deployed, or they're being associated with kind of a master or like a main chart, where Gen3 here is the main chart. And we can change the folder structure a little bit to make it more clear that like Gen3 is kind of the entry point, but some people are still deploying these individually. But we were trying to think of some of the quality of the developer quality of life stuff a little bit there.
What we can do is to move the Gen3 chart outside of the Helm chart here and have it be like a main chart folder or something. And then we just update the references to each of the child charts. So the child charts are still inside this Helm folder, but the Gen3, which is the main one, can be in the main folder here. Maybe that will make it clearer, but and then you'll still be able to get that relationship a little bit clearer, that the Gen3 one is the umbrella chart. Still be able to deploy the individual charts. Yeah. Again, that we just have to think about something that works. This was just the easiest and cleanest to just get us started, essentially.
If they're graded,
I think the only effect that should have on folks using Helm would be if you've cloned or forked the repository and made manual changes to the Helm charts.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
The charts themselves, not to the values.
just run this across as many.
One more question that I have for you folks that have been trying to decipher all this work is, what areas would you like to be documented a little bit better, that we can possibly try to tackle? Customization came up as one. Is there any other areas that you would, or any requests for documentation?
All the big.
We had some challenges with the data dictionary documentation.
Anything that goes in
setting up custom data dictionaries and doing the the conversion, like the TSV to YAML to JSON conversion. We had to go in and find a downstream fork that had some updates and changes to get it to work. So I think there's some pull requests that are hanging out there that might need to be merged. But that was one area that was kind of challenging. Like we weren't sure, okay, so we got this up and running, but the day two operations, like the what nows are really the big areas. And that was one of them. It's like, okay, I need to add a node now. How do I actually do that?
Right.
It was challenging.
Okay, and those are kind of like generic or general Gen3 documentation stuff that kind of falls a little bit outside of Helm, but it's still a part of setting up Gen3. So I kind of agree. Okay, how to add nodes, data submission. Yeah,
That kind of led into our deployment of like, okay, now we've got our dictionary created, our custom dictionary. Now, how do I pull that back into the Helm deployment to make sure that as I redeploy this, or if I do disaster recovery or something like that, that my dictionary comes with it. That's how it tied back. But there's that bridge in the middle of like, okay, how do I make a dictionary? That was
right.
That one is.
Yeah, I think a step-by-step guide on what constitutes of setting up Gen3 would possibly be helpful as well. So you have the deployment, but you also need a data dictionary. You need to understand what data submission really means, and a lot of that. I think that's something that would be really helpful for the community to understand Gen3 a little bit better. And I'm kind of just adding on work for myself here.
So we have a lot of, the user services team, which is sort of outside this deployment process, has a lot of documentation on creating dictionaries and data submission. But since this is sort of a new effort, they're probably not all findable in one area, like the steps for setting up a Gen3, and then passing the baton on to these other sets of documentation. So I'm sure we could do a better job of, putting pointers in to those others. That's a good idea.
Yep.
Yeah, I think that discoverability, you probably nailed that.
Skill set that you're wanting to use.
Hit the nail on the head. Can't think of words.
Yep.
Jawad, I was a quick one on the Elasticsearch. I think all that it's really looking for is at this point, is a flag. What was it? It's just to allow backwards compatibility. There's like a configuration value. I'll catch up with you on that one later. I think it's a small shift to get that working for a supported version of Elastic.
Yep, we're almost done. I don't know if you joined a little bit late, but we're almost ready to start supporting newer version of Elasticsearch, and we're hoping to be able to include like the official Elasticsearch Helm charts as subcharts. It's just like we do with Postgres, essentially. I think the Bitnami people that created the Postgres charts might have Elasticsearch charts as well. Right.
Hacker something.
Yeah. Sumesh, regarding it, are you talking about like the actual like CPU and memory requests for the deployment?
Oh, right.
Yeah. So for now, what we've done is we've scaled according to metrics from like different sources. So we use Datadog in production. We recently reduced our sizes of pods because they were over provisioned a little bit. But that's maybe something that we can also try to have a better better footprint or resource overview between environments. Yeah, I think the defaults should apply everywhere, but that also depends on your cluster setup. With that said, you can also override them in Helm easily using the values YAML. So if you do see a need to adjust them, that should be relatively straightforward. As in cloud automation, it was next to impossible. You have to literally fork our whole repository to be able to set custom resource requests and limit. But in Helm, you can send in overrides essentially.
The reason for asking this actually in the cloud automation, we are tweaking the values in the deployment configuration, wherein we're adjusting the memory and the CPU requirements. Whereas when it comes to the Helm chart deployment, is there any way option to select it? This is the footprint run to deploy. So if that option is supplied, then the deployment will go accordingly. That's what probably it could be kind of enhancement, or else it could be kind of feature thing. But
you can already override them for all of our charts. So again, this is controllable via the values YAML. So I believe there should be resources. So you can set custom CPU and memory requests, and same thing for the limits inside here. So if you provide overrides here, you should be able to do that without having to fork the repository. So your values YAML will be the one that take precedence over the defaults. I don't know if that answers the question. Were you looking for guidance on what to set, or?
Yeah, that's what actually. I'm looking for the guidance right now. With the given values, we have observed that the ETL job was failed a couple of times. So we have to increase the existing the given recommendations so that the job went smooth. So suppose any recommendations with respect to the production or staging is tested, so we can set the values accordingly, and we can move on. So right now, no recommendations, it seems. Probably I'm not looking for the right place.
Yeah, I don't think we have any official recommendation, but that's maybe something that we can work on and share what works for us at least. So the values that are in cloud automation are essentially what we're using in production for us now, but that might not be a like a one size fits all essentially. So yeah, that's maybe something that I can try to formulate better in our documentation, and yeah. Yeah.
One thought on that might be helpful is now that you've got some default values in there in the values file, maybe we just verify that, just do the sums and verify that the RAM requirements and CPU requirements are up to date, or like somewhere in the documentation, because I think there's like a reference to like 8 gigabytes to CPU or something, which might be a little out of date for the Kubernetes part of the stack based on the resource request.
True.
I think Chris or somebody else had questions about that when they were having trouble on a 16 gig MacBook.
Right. That is correct, because we had to bump up the portal one once we started allowing the customized portal. So you might be correct that these CPU and memory requirements might have gone up since the first time the documentation was written.
I think that's a good opportunity to clarify like the in production versus the development or something.
Yeah.
Like having dev recommendations versus prod. It's just creating more work, I know.
I know. Yeah, this is great feedback, and it'll help shape the documentation work that we're going to undertake over the next few sprints. Yeah, we've got like roughly 10 minutes left. I don't know if there are any other questions or stuff that you might be struggling with that I can help with. You've got me hostage for 9 more minutes.
I imagine Michael's probably going to ask, does anybody have any recommendations or something they'd like to see in the next one of these that we do?
That's a good question. So I guess I could say that this was offered as sort of part of the overall Gen3 forum activities, which are, much broader than Helm and focused on other Gen3 work. The next one is going to be focused on data meshes or ecosystems, by the way, and that's going to be on May 1st. Let me just put that in the chat so you can see. Sorry, I wasn't ready for that. Here. So, okay, yeah, you can sign up for what other events are going on with Gen3. The only one that's scheduled right now is today's, and then how to build a data mesh, which is sort of a larger way of linking different data commons together through a minimal set of resources. As far as mesh activities, or sorry, as far as Helm activities, we hadn't really thought about other events beyond what I mentioned at the very beginning, is that we have an event next week, which I hope those of you who are interested in contributing to and shaping Helm will attend. That is to figure out, for us to give you advice on how to make pull requests, how to make issues, report bugs, etc. As I think has been clear, our platform engineering team cannot do all the things for everyone on all things Helm that we would like. And so we're hoping that your expertise can, help bring the community forward. So not only communicating in Slack, but, if you find some improvements that are needed for OpenStack or Google Cloud, we'd love to see, that reflected in the actual code. So, but Colin or others, if you have other ideas on what you kind of need or want to move Helm forward, I'd love to hear those as well.
I guess my questions are starting to branch beyond Helm and more like kind of cloud environment management in general. One like they kind of still tie together. One area that I've seen is we're having trouble getting clear guidance on kind of some of the compliance side things, or trying to get some information. And it might be cool to see for like what does Chicago do on the compliance side, right? Like what are the compliance concerns that we meet, and maybe work backwards in like how we meet those. But I know we point to like NIST, right? 800, what is it, 853, and we talk about ATO and some things there, but it's like, how do we run this in a compliant way, and how does Gen3 help us meet some of that? Would be kind of cool for a future.
No, that's a good idea. That is on our short or medium-sized list of Gen3 forum topics, is to talk about security and compliance and how those are sort of affected through Gen3. So I will note that there's active interest in that, because we currently have zero public information on that right now. So I can imagine that would be helpful.
Something that I want to kind of look at is eventually, once all of you have your Gen3 sites up and running, I would love to see them and see like what you're using them for, and be able to see like where Gen3 runs in the wild, because it's kind of cool and fun to be able to see that for us at the center. So if you have something to share, that'd be really cool. And then the community can also see like what you're working on.
Yeah, no, we'd love to see that. There is, it appears in different places, but here's one site where we've gathered some Gen3 commons, and we'd love to add, not necessarily updated with the information, but at least at the bottom, powered by Gen3. We, whenever, or if anybody's comfortable in having their logo there once they have a site set up, we'd love to display it.
Is there a repo for that site? That would be a great first commit for y'all to highlight in part of your next thing.
There is a repo for this. Yeah, if you just go to UCCTDS, I think it's, well, maybe it's not public.
Almost
but
like
if you-
it's like getting your Gen 3 certification, add it to this list. That's
Yeah,
kind of
that's a good first step. Yeah.
I'm a huge fan of that K9 Data Commons. That's awesome.
Yeah, no, that one is nice in particular because it is mostly open access, because they're dogs, so it's a good display commons for showing people. Okay, 2 more minutes. Any final any quick questions from the crowd? Cool. Well, like I said, next week, Thursday, let me know if you haven't gotten an invite yet and you'd like one. Otherwise, feel free to hit us up on Gen3 Helm external on Slack. So yeah, thanks everybody. Talk to you all soon.
Thank you.